31 points per game, 50 points in back-to-back games, an MVP award in an overseas league that nobody can take off her resume. By every statistical measure that professional basketball uses to evaluate offensive talent, Chennedy Carter is producing at a level that should have had 12 different front offices fighting over her contract. Instead, not a single one of them called. Not Atlanta, not Los Angeles, not even Chicago, the organization that drafted her, watched her become their leading scorer, and then quietly let the whole situation dissolve into one of the most uncomfortable stories in recent WNBA history. 12 franchises, 0 phone calls, and the silence has been going on long enough now that it has stopped feeling like an oversight and started feeling like a verdict. But here's what makes this story genuinely complicated, and why it deserves more than the surface-level takes that have been floating around since last summer. The verdict did not come from nowhere. It did not come from one bad night, one flagrant foul, or one viral clip that caught the wrong moment at the wrong angle. It came from a specific pattern across multiple organizations, a specific podcast appearance that landed exactly the wrong way, and a specific accusation about Angel Reese that has raised more questions about Carter than it has answered about anyone else. She broke 14 months of silence. She chose her platform carefully. She delivered a detailed, multi-step account of what she says really happened on that court. And somehow, when it was all over, her situation with every team in the league appeared even less likely to change than it was before she opened her mouth. We're going to go through every layer of this today. The organizational collapse that set the stage, the incident itself and what the footage actually shows, the podcast calculation and what it tells you about Carter's strategy, the Angel Reese accusation and why it is structurally more serious than most coverage has been willing to say out loud, and the commercial reality that explains, more than anything else, why the league's silence on Chennedy Carter has the feel of something permanent rather than something temporary. This story is not about one play on one night. It never was. Before you can make sense of anything Carter said on that podcast, you need to understand what the Chicago Sky actually was in 2024. Because what happened between her and Caitlin Clark in June of that year was not a random eruption. It was the end product of an organization that had been decaying from the inside for an entire season, and arguably longer than that. When GM Jeff Pagliocca dismissed head coach Teresa Weatherspoon following the 2024 season, something unusual happened. He did not give the standard press conference language about going in a new direction or pursuing a different vision for the franchise. Front office executives almost never say anything specific when they fire coaches because specificity creates liability and invites follow-up questions they would rather not answer. Pagliocca did not follow that script. League sources confirmed that Weatherspoon's coaching environment had, in the words of those same sources, catered to the needs of specific players rather than building a competitive basketball team. Read that slowly, because it is remarkable language for a general manager to put on record about a coach he employed. He was not saying the team underperformed or that results were disappointing. He was saying that the institutional purpose of the coaching staff had fundamentally drifted away from winning basketball games and toward keeping certain individuals comfortable. That is a different accusation entirely. The on-court numbers made the failure impossible to argue with. Chicago finished the 2024 season at 13 wins and 27 losses, sitting near the bottom of the entire league. But buried inside that losing record was something even more specific and more damning. Sources inside the league described the offensive structure in language that was direct and pointed. The offense was being deliberately run to manufacture statistical milestones for Angel Reese, not occasionally, not as a secondary consideration, but as a primary organizational objective. The specific example that kept surfacing was the team running post-heavy sets designed to get Reese to double-double thresholds against opposing bench units while already trailing by more than 20 points in games that had been decided an hour earlier. Let that land for a second. The coaching staff was not trying to cut into deficits. They were not developing young players or installing new systems or doing any of the things a losing team might reasonably prioritize to build towards something better. They were running plays to get one player to a statistical milestone in garbage time. The organizational objective was a box score number, not a basketball outcome. This is the context Chennedy Carter was operating in every single day. She was the team's leading scorer at 17.5 points per game, a first-round pick with legitimate offensive ability who had earned her place in that lineup through production, not politics. And she was watching the offense around her get restructured in real time to serve someone else's statistics, with zero intervention from the people who were supposed to be running the program with any kind of competitive integrity.
That does not excuse what happened later. Nothing does, and we will get to that directly. But understanding the specific kind of frustration that environment produces, the feeling of watching institutional dysfunction go completely unchallenged day after day, is essential to understanding how a moment like the one in June became possible. When the people in charge stop caring about the actual game, everyone below them eventually stops trusting the structure, and when the structure fails, individual behavior tends to follow. Critically, and this is the part that connects most directly to the Carter situation, her conduct issues throughout that season were going completely unaddressed. Nobody was drawing lines. Nobody was establishing consequences. The behavioral patterns that would eventually produce the most high-profile moment of her career were being allowed to accumulate without a single meaningful correction from the coaching staff or front office. When an organization tells a player, through its silence and inaction, that accountability has no teeth, that player rarely self-corrects. People do not usually manage their own behavior upward when no one around them is requiring it. So, you had a losing team, a coaching staff restructuring the offense around one player's statistics, a leading scorer whose conduct was escalating without correction, and a locker room full of players watching all of it build in real time with no institutional intervention in sight. The fracture was not a question of if, it was a question of when and how publicly. What happened next is the part that should have triggered every alarm inside that organization. Instead, management watched it play out in silence. Carter posted a tweet about layup efficiency, specifically about how the ability to consistently convert layups separates players into different competitive tiers. No name was attached to the post. None needed to be. Everyone watching understood exactly who the target was, and the timing made the subtext impossible to miss. This was not a general basketball observation posted into the void. It was a direct shot at a teammate delivered through the thin cover of plausible deniability. Reese responded with 4 words, "What's understood don't need to be explained." And just like that, 2 active players on the same roster were publicly exchanging shots on social media in the middle of an ongoing season, in front of every fan, analyst, journalist, and front office executive paying attention to the league. Management said nothing. No statement, no mediation attempt, no visible effort to contain what was already a PR situation for the franchise and a cultural disaster for the locker room. The organization simply allowed 2 of its players to conduct a public feud on the internet as though it had no stake in the outcome and no authority to intervene. That silence was not a strategic choice. It was proof that by that point, the institutional structure inside the Chicago Sky had already stopped functioning. The outside confirmation that makes this picture complete came from Marina Mabrey. After being traded to the Connecticut Sun, Mabrey's first public comments about her new situation were pointed in a way that felt almost deliberate. She said she was thrilled to be on a team capable of competing for a championship. Then she went further. She described Connecticut's culture as one defined by discipline and professionalism, where experienced veterans hold players accountable and actively protect the competitive environment. She talked about what it felt like to be part of a program that actually expected something from its players and backed that expectation with consequences. She did all of this without mentioning Chicago by name, not once. She did not need to, because everything she described as Connecticut's defining strengths read as a precise, point-by-point inversion of the environment she had just escaped. Discipline where there had been chaos, accountability where there had been favoritism, professionalism where there had been social media beefs playing out in public view. Mabry was inside that locker room for the entire season. She saw the stat padding up close. She watched the gap between what the coaching staff was prioritizing and what the team actually needed widen week by week. She observed the favoritism, the absence of consequences, the culture of accommodation that had replaced any genuine competitive standard. And the moment she had a way out, her first public statements about her new home read like a clinical diagnosis of everything wrong with the place she had just left. That is the soil the June 2024 incident grew from. Not a spontaneous moment of aggression, not a player with a bad temper making a reckless mistake in an isolated situation, but the inevitable product of an organization that had been rotting for months and had given everyone inside it every reason to believe that nothing they did would carry any real consequence.
And it is also the backdrop against which Chennedy Carter is now attempting, 14 months later, to rewrite the narrative by redirecting blame toward her former teammate. The organization failed, the coaching staff failed, the institutional structure collapsed completely, but Carter is the one who delivered a flagrant foul on a player who was nowhere near the play, and no amount of context changes what that looks like on film. June 2024, the Chicago Sky versus the Indiana Fever. Caitlin Clark is off the ball, moving through a possession that has nothing to do with what is about to happen to her. Chennedy Carter delivers a deliberate hip check. The contact is flagrant. It is caught on film from multiple angles, and it is the kind of play that exists in a completely different category from hard fouls, physical defense, or the contact that happens naturally in a professional basketball game. The footage does not require interpretation. It does not benefit from additional context. What is visible, and what is visible is a player being hit by someone who had a choice about whether to make that contact. Clark got up, made her free throws, and then said something that the entire situation did not deserve from her. It is what it is. It's a physical game. Go make the free throw. No campaign for a harsher suspension. No tweet that night. No podcast booked for the following week to discuss how she had been wronged. No performance of victimhood designed to generate sympathy and headlines. She just kept playing and let the game continue. For someone who was already the most visible player in the sport, someone who could have turned that moment into weeks of sustained media coverage entirely in her favor, the decision to make it smaller was notable. That is not a PR calculation. That is not media training. That is a person under genuine pressure deciding that the score is what matters and the result is what will speak for her. Every front office in the league was watching that response just as closely as they were watching the foul itself, and the contrast between the two players in that moment told its own story. Carter's response in the immediate aftermath was the opposite. When reporters gathered in the locker room after the game and asked about the incident, her answer was short, definitive, and telling. "I ain't answering no Caitlin Clark questions." Complete stonewalling, total refusal of accountability at the exact moment it was being formally requested. No explanation, no acknowledgement, no engagement with what had just happened on the court in front of thousands of people and millions watching at home. That answer mattered more than most coverage gave it credit for at the time. It was not just a player being defensive or emotional after a difficult game. It was a signal about how Carter intended to handle the situation, and the league was paying attention. The question of whether she would eventually take responsibility, demonstrate understanding of what had happened and why it was unacceptable, became part of the evaluation every front office was quietly running on her future. The clock on that evaluation started ticking the moment she refused to answer. The suspension came, the season continued, and then, for a long stretch, Chennedy Carter went quiet. No detailed explanation, no public accountability, no engagement with the incident beyond that initial refusal, just silence. which, given everything that came next, turned out to be the more strategic choice she made throughout this entire situation. 14 months after the incident, Chennedy Carter broke her silence. The platform she selected for that moment tells you almost everything you need to know about the strategy behind it. She did not reach out to ESPN. She did not sit down with The Athletic. She did not seek out a journalist with an accountability infrastructure, someone whose job is to ask the follow-up question when an answer is incomplete, to push on the inconsistency when the timeline does not hold together, to provide the adversarial pressure that turns a public statement into an actual reckoning. She chose Neon's platform, and that choice was not made carelessly. Neon is not a sports journalist. His entire brand is built on spectacle, viral energy, and high-momentum moments. His audience does not come to those streams looking for rigorous examination of claims and counterclaims. They come for the heat of the moment, the energy of a big reveal, the collective experience of watching something blow up in real time. That platform is not going to press a guest for precise, verifiable answers when the energy in the room is better served by letting the story escalate naturally. The incentives point in the opposite direction from accountability. Carter understood this perfectly. What that platform offered her was exactly what she needed: maximum reach, because Neon's audience is enormous and engaged, and minimum pressure, because the format is not designed to challenge the narrative of the guest. She could deliver her version of events to the largest possible audience with the smallest possible risk of being pushed into uncomfortable territory. That is not an accident of venue selection. That is a deliberate strategic calculation made by someone who needed to control the story without actually being tested on it. The account she delivered goes like this. Before the play, she says, she was elbowed. Then something was said to her directly. Then someone was in her face. Then she hit a shot coming back down the court, and that is when the hip check happened. What Carter built is a chain of escalating provocations with a physical response at the end. An elbow, a verbal exchange, a direct confrontation, an emotional reaction, a consequence. And she constructed that chain specifically to make the hip check feel like a final link rather than a standalone act, to make it feel inevitable rather than chosen.
The chain matters because of what it implies. If the hip check was the end of a sequence, then the beginning of the sequence carries some of the responsibility for the end. That is the logical architecture of the argument she is making. She is not saying she lost her composure in an isolated moment with no preceding context. She is saying there was a structured, escalating set of provocations that built toward a predictable outcome, and the person who initiated that chain was responsible for where it ended. That argument is designed to share the blame, but the precision with which it shares the blame, and specifically who it names as the driver of the chain, is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Carter did not simply say the situation escalated and she reacted. She named Angel Reese as the central force behind the chain of events, not as someone who was also involved in a chaotic moment, not as a teammate who was caught up in the same emotional atmosphere, as the person who drove the sequence, the person who, in Carter's framing, directed the escalation that ended with a flagrant foul on Caitlin Clark. Be precise about what that actually claims, because it is considerably more serious than it sounds on first listen. Carter is not saying she snapped. She is not offering an account of someone who lost emotional control in a high-pressure moment and did something she regrets. She is alleging that the aggression was architected, that her former teammate coordinated and directed a sequence of events that was designed to produce a specific physical outcome. She is saying, in language that has real implications if taken seriously, that she was the executor of a play that someone else called. That is not deflection. That is an accusation of deliberate orchestration against a named individual with no corroboration from anyone else who was on that court or in that building. Now layer on the context that makes this accusation even more difficult to evaluate fairly. The person making it was publicly feuding with the person she is accusing on social media during the same season the incident occurred.
Carter was the one who fired the opening shot with the layup tweet. Reese was the one who responded. They were already in a documented public conflict before the June game ever happened. The notion that Carter is a neutral, disinterested reporter of Reese's behavior in that moment, with no personal or competitive motivation coloring her account, does not survive contact with the timeline. Furthermore, the structural problem with her argument does not disappear even if you accept every element of the chain at face value. Even if there was an elbow, even if words were exchanged, even if someone was directly in her face, even if every single detail of Carter's timeline is accurate and verifiable, none of it transfers the legal or ethical responsibility for a deliberate flagrant foul to whoever was talking on the court. The WNBA does not evaluate intent based on what a teammate may or may not have said during a possession. They evaluate what is visible on film. And what is visible on film is a player who was not involved in the play, receiving a deliberate hip check from someone who had multiple opportunities to make a different decision. 14 months of explanations cannot change what is in the footage. The footage exists independently of any account Carter gives on any platform she chooses. It was reviewed at the time, it was reviewed again after the podcast, and the image it presents has not shifted based on what she said on the stream. What the podcast appearance actually accomplished was something Carter almost certainly did not intend. It made Reese a named target in a public accusation, while simultaneously reminding every analyst and fan paying attention to this situation of all the documented history between them. The social media beef, the organizational tension, the fact that a teammate who was inside that same locker room described her new team in language that sounded like an escape. Connecting those dots became the dominant conversation in the days following the appearance, and almost none of that conversation landed in a direction that helped Carter's case. Reese spent her entire rookie season navigating a complicated public perception, the stat padding narrative, the locker room tension that went public on Twitter, the departure of a teammate whose first public statements about her new team read like a diagnosis of everything wrong with the one she left. And now, on top of all of that, she is being named on a public platform as the person who ordered a flagrant foul on the most commercially significant player in the sport, with no corroboration, delivered by someone with a documented personal conflict with her, on a platform specifically chosen because it does not press for accountability.
That is the accusation Carter decided to make 14 months after the fact. And the question worth asking is not whether it helped her tell her side of the story. The question is whether it helped her get back into the league. Because those are two very different objectives, and the platform she chose optimized entirely for one of them. While Carter was calculating which platform would give her the most reach with the least scrutiny, the player she hip-checked was quietly doing something else entirely. Clark made her free throws on the night it happened. She addressed the incident directly and briefly in the immediate aftermath, and then she moved forward. No extended media tour about what she had experienced, no carefully worded statement from her representation designed to maximize sympathy, no tweet crafted to remind everyone what had been done to her. She absorbed a moment, converted the free throws, and kept playing basketball. For someone with every legitimate reason to amplify that incident, the most visible player in a sport experiencing its greatest commercial moment in history, someone who could have generated weeks of sympathetic headlines entirely in her favor, the decision to deflate it instead was striking. That is not media training. That is not a calculated PR move designed to make her look composed for brand purposes. That is a person under genuine pressure deciding that the work is the answer and that anything else is noise. Every franchise in the league was watching that response. They were watching it the night it happened, and they have been watching everything that has followed it since. The contrast between how Clark handled that moment and how Carter has handled the 14 months after it is the kind of comparison that front offices do not need to articulate to act on. Now, here is the commercial context that makes the league's position on Carter even more structurally significant than the conduct narrative alone. The Indiana Fever drew over 600,000 fans in a single season.
WNBA merchandise sales increased more than 500% compared to the year before Clark arrived in the league. Player jersey sales across the entire league went up 1,000%. Not just Clark's jersey. Every player in the WNBA saw their commercial visibility increase because the entire sport got pulled upward by what Clark's presence was doing to the market. And here is the detail that almost no coverage has examined closely enough. The league is actively using Clark's commercial transformation as leverage in the ongoing collective bargaining process. They are making the case to broadcast partners and sponsors that women's basketball's marketability has fundamentally and permanently shifted, and they are using that case to negotiate better contract structures, higher compensation, and improved working conditions for every single player currently on a WNBA roster. The player whose former teammate just publicly accused her of orchestrating a flagrant foul is simultaneously the players whose market value is being deployed to improve every other player's financial future. That is the environment in which Chennedy Carter chose to deliver her podcast accusation. That is the specific moment she decided was the right time to name Clark's name, frame herself as a victim of coordinated aggression, and do it on a platform designed for viral energy rather than journalistic scrutiny. The timing is not incidental to how it was received. The timing is part of the reason the response to it landed the way it did. The Atlanta Dream, the Los Angeles Sparks, the Chicago Sky. 3 different cities, 3 completely different front offices with different ownership structures, different coaching philosophies, different organizational priorities, and no coordination with each other on personnel decisions, and 3 identical conclusions about the same player. That pattern is the most significant piece of evidence in this entire story, and it has received a fraction of the analytical attention it deserves. In each of those organizations, Carter was evaluated independently by people who had no reason to reach a predetermined conclusion about her. Front offices do not pass around informal blacklists in professional sports, at least not openly. They conduct their own evaluations, their own interviews, their own film study and character assessments. Each of those 3 organizations went through that process on Chennedy Carter and arrived at the same place without being pointed there by anyone else. The talent was never the concern. 31 points per game on 51% shooting in an overseas MVP season settles the talent argument completely and permanently. Nobody is looking at those numbers and concluding that Carter cannot play. The behavioral and conduct concerns were consistent enough across 3 completely independent organizational evaluations that every new front office reached the same conclusion without coordinating with the others. When a pattern is that uniform across an entire professional career, spread across multiple cities, multiple coaching staffs, and multiple front office cultures, it stops being about any individual organization's preferences or internal culture. It starts reflecting something persistent that travels with the player regardless of the environment she enters.
And now a 4th data point has been added to that pattern. Not from an organization evaluating her as a potential roster addition, but from Carter herself. Every interview she gives explaining what happened 14 months ago. Every version of the story in which someone else bears primary responsibility for where things ended up. Every platform she selects specifically because it will not press her for precise, accountable answers. Every one of those choices refreshes the comparison that front offices across the league are already making. It does not change their calculation. It confirms it. What makes the league's current position historically meaningful is the specific trade-off it represents. The WNBA effectively declined to roster a player whose overseas production would rank among the best scoring outputs in the entire league. They did it unanimously. They did it during the period of greatest commercial visibility and opportunity the league has ever experienced. And the player whose conduct created the situation is the same player whose behavior stands in direct contrast to everything the league is trying to be in this specific moment. That is not a routine personnel preference. That is not one GM deciding he does not want the headache. That is a structural declaration from an entire professional league about what it values and what it will not accept during the period when those values are most visible and most consequential.
When 12 franchises reach the same conclusion simultaneously without coordinating, it becomes a precedent. And precedents do not stay theoretical. They define every decision that comes after them. The Indiana Fever are the most important organizational story in women's basketball right now. Not because of their record, not because of any single player, but because of the specific way they built what they have and the specific culture that emerged from those choices. Aaliyah Boston has spoken publicly about how Clark's constant encouragement keeps her locked in and competitive even on the team's most difficult nights. Not just the basketball encouragement, not just the good shot in the middle of a run, but the sustained, deliberate investment in her teammates' confidence and competitive fire. Kelsey Mitchell is operating in more space than she has had at any point in her career because defenders cannot afford to leave Clark open for a single possession, which means Mitchell's opportunities expand every time she touches the ball. Lexi Hall is doing the invisible work that championship-level teams require without seeking recognition for any of it, because the culture around her does not require or reward that kind of self-promotion. That locker room was built deliberately. It was built around accountability, around collective purpose, around the understanding that individual statistics are downstream of team culture and not the other way around. It is the direct structural opposite of what Teresa Weatherspoon allowed to develop in Chicago, and every front office in the league is studying it. The Fever are not just a successful team, they are a model. They are the answer to the question every GM is now asking themselves about what kind of organization they want to build and what kind of player they are willing to build it around. And the contrast that model creates with the Carter situation is not something Carter can reduce through podcast appearances or narrative reframing. Every time she appears on a platform to explain what happened 14 months ago, every time she constructs an account in which blame is distributed to someone other than herself, the comparison to how Clark handled the same incident gets sharper and more visible, not less. Visibility, right now, is the most consequential currency in the entire sport. The league is in the middle of the most commercially significant period in its history. Broadcast deals are being negotiated, sponsorships are expanding, the collective bargaining conversation is happening in real time with actual financial stakes for every player in the league. The organizational decisions being made right now, which players get rosters, which cultures get rewarded, which precedents get established, will shape the structure of women's professional basketball for the next decade. Chennedy Carter is sitting at the edge of all of that, with overseas MVP numbers that no one can dismiss and an organizational track record across 3 franchises that 12 front offices apparently cannot get past. The question of whether any of that changes is not really about talent at this point. It hasn't been about talent for a while. It is about whether the pattern that has followed her across 3 cities, the pattern that produced the June 2024 incident, the pattern she demonstrated again by choosing a viral content platform over a journalistic one to deliver a 14 months late accusation, whether that pattern is something she is willing to confront directly rather than explain away. The podcast did not answer that question. It may have made it harder to answer.
Here is the thing about Chennedy Carter's situation that gets lost in every surface-level take about one foul on one night. The league is not keeping her out because of a single play. If that were the case, players with longer disciplinary histories and worse conduct records would face the same unanimous verdict, and most of them do not. Carter is where she is because across 3 independent organizations, across years of professional evaluation, across multiple coaching staffs and front office cultures that had no reason to arrive at the same conclusion, the answer kept coming back the same way. And the podcast appearance did not change that answer. It reminded everyone of why the answer existed in the first place. Talent is the price of entry into professional basketball. It gets you into the conversation, it gets you evaluated, it gets your film watched and your numbers compared. But talent is not what keeps the door open once the conduct evaluation begins. And when 12 franchises conduct that evaluation independently and reach identical results, the door does not just close quietly.
It closes in a way that defines a new standard for every personnel decision that follows. The WNBA is in the middle of something genuinely historic. The commercial transformation Clark brought to this league is lifting every player inside it, financially, professionally, and in terms of visibility and cultural impact. The franchises that are thriving right now are the ones that understood early that the competitive environment, the locker room culture, the accountability infrastructure are not soft considerations to be balanced against hard talent numbers. They are the foundation that talent builds on. Tear that foundation out, and you get Chicago 2024. Build it correctly, and you get Indiana right now. Chennedy Carter can score. That has never been the question. The question, the one she has not answered yet in any forum on any platform, is whether she can be the player a franchise builds around without introducing the problems that have defined her career up to this point. Until that question has a different answer, the silence from 12 front offices is going to continue, not as a punishment, not as a coordinated effort to keep a talented player out of the sport she excels in, just as the sound of an entire league making a values decision and waiting to see if anything changes.